Hey guys, so if you are watching this, you know that we're going to talk about some lectures online today, and hopefully I'm going to make it to the beach, weather permitting, but if not, you can still have these video lectures. So we're going to be talking about planning for assessment, and the first thing you do with planning for assessment is working through your objectives, your standards, identifying your goal for your unit, and then working on your lesson plan. So the first thing that you need to think about is what is the difference between a goal and an objective? What makes those different? Your book, the Little Rainbow book, does a really good job at talking about differences between what is a goal, what is an objective, how you write those differently so that they encompass different things. Generally speaking, you have the goal and then you have the objectives. The way I like to think about it, um, okay, so I was going to show you my umbrella, but I have one, but not right in my hand. But if you think of the little top part of the umbrella that's on the very top, and then you think of the outer part of the umbrella where you have all the little metal things that come out. The top part is what I like to call the goal. And then all those metal things that go around the edge, I like to call the objectives. Okay, so if you think about that top part, the goal has to be very broad, very general. All those objectives underneath that umbrella have to cover and connect with that goal. All right, so goals are broad statements. They include general areas to be covered. They could be related to anything. So your goals differ in that the level of specificity. So your goals are very broad, your objectives are very specific. Goals don't always include exactly what will be covered in very specific details. It doesn't always have to identify things that are measurable and observable. It can be, just a very broad statement. So for example, take for instance this measurement class. A goal that I could put for you is students will understand components of instructional objectives. Okay? Students will understand components of instructional objectives. That could be a goal. Then an objective to that is students will be able to write instructional objectives. Students will be able to identify an instructional objective. Okay, so students will be able to write instructional objectives. Students will be able to identify instructional objectives. So if I did that as my two objectives, and I'm going to write this, should have printed it for you. All right, so students will be able to. Let me see if you can see that. All right, students will be able to. So on each part of your objective, you're going to have students will be able to. What will they be able to do? You can do the learner will, the student will, whatever you do, it needs to be consistent. And this is SWBAT, and that's just an abbreviation for that. Okay, so students will be able to. What will students be able to do after you have taught that lesson? You can go back and say, now they know how to do this. Okay, so students will be able to write instructional objectives, identify instructional objectives. All right, so students will be able to write instructional objectives. You see that? Students will be able to identify instructional objectives. Okay, so my goal was students will understand I'm just going to make it even bigger. Students will understand goals and objectives. All right, so if my goal is students will understand goals and objectives, how does that differ from the objectives? Again, your book does a really good job at showing you the difference between general goals and specific objectives. Okay, So in a goal, we have the word understand. That is not observable. You can't observe somebody understanding. Measurable, you can measure it, but how? You have to be very specific. So understand is one of those words that it's not an action verb that is both measurable and observable. Okay? So when you write instructional objectives, you want them to be both measurable and observable. And in order to do that, they have to have action verbs that are measurable and observable. And so these action verbs are write and identify. If I ask students to write, can you observe that? Yes. If I ask students to write, can you measure that? Yes, because they can actually write you an objective and you can see if they know how to write an objective. Identify. Is that measurable? Yes. Is it observable? Yes. You can give them a list of objectives and say which one is an objective, which one is a goal. They will be able to identify which is which. So those are action verbs that are both measurable and observable. Okay? If you look within Blackboard, there should be lists under course documents. There's some Bloom's taxonomy things that have lists of action verbs. And this is one that's tied to Bloom's taxonomy. And I have handouts, so if it's not on there, I can get that to you in class. But we tie this with Bloom's taxonomy: knowledge, comprehension, synthesis, evaluation, application. These verbs are action verbs: assess, critique, relate, state, locate, describe, explain. Those are all action verbs that can help you write your objectives so that not only that you cover all the content, but you assess them at different levels. You assess them at levels of knowledge, comprehension, application. So if you use those action verbs, then you already know you're assessing students at different levels, and you don't just have to assess them at the knowledge level, because they may just be kindergarten or first grade or second grade, but that doesn't mean that we can't assess them at higher levels of learning. Okay? So when you write objectives, students will be able to do what? Followed by the action verb, whatever your action verb is, and both of mine are knowledge. Okay? These would both be at the knowledge level: write and identify. So write, what will they write? Instructional objectives. Identify, what will they identify? Instructional objectives. Okay? So if we look at a little exercise, I have a few somewhere. Objectives written and goals, so that if you wanted to try to figure out which was a goal and which one was objective. So if I said students will comprehend data in various forms, goal or an objective? Goal. Good job. Students will be able to calculate mean, median, and mode for data sets. Objective. Very good. Students will determine the effect of outliers on data sets. It is an objective, but it also needs to include students will be able to. But it is okay if you put students will. You just want to be consistent. So on everything put students will, or on each one put students will be able to. Okay, here's another one. Students will appreciate simple and compound probabilities. Goal. Appreciate. Appreciate is not observable. You can't observe somebody appreciating something. All right, so the key thing is that action verb measurable and observable? Sorry, blacked out. All right, students will be able to create stem and leaf plots. Objective. Students will understand stem and leaf plots. Goal. Okay, so hopefully you see the difference. All right, another thing to remember when you're writing objectives effectively, you want to make sure they have one and only one action verb. So if I said students will be able to list and describe, that's two action verbs. So listing is different than describing. So if they're two separate things, then you need to list them as two separate objectives. Okay, does that make sense? I hope so. All right, sometimes you can even say, you might want to use an objective and say, following class discussion, students will be able to, and that's okay. Or you can say, students will be able to define clouds following class activity. All right, that's fine. If there is something that is required in the teaching process that they have to be able to have that in order to master that objective, then you should include it in the objective. Okay, so if I said students will calculate percentages using graphing calculators, or students will use rulers, like the ruler, the calculator, the map, the computer, students will create PowerPoint using PowerPoint and computers. Whatever the tool is, if there's a tool that they need to master that objective proficiently, then you need to include that tool in your objective. Okay? For your objectives, you want to be specific as possible. You don't always have to include the accuracy. Like some people will say students will be able to complete with 80% accuracy. You can, but those don't always apply to every objective. It may only apply to like your unit objective or your test for your objective. Okay? So I might say after completing the unit on planets, students will be able to list the 9 planets in order. That's fine. And you don't even have to say list the 9 planets. You can just say list the planets, because on some days you may not cover all 9. So that way you have a little bit more freedom. And so when you tie your test question to this objective, you don't have to say list the 9 planets, because technically 9 is a clue. So if you just said list the planets, then that would be kind of like a higher order question, more along the comprehension line. Listing is knowledge, but if you don't put that specific 9 on there, then it makes it a little bit more higher level for those students to have to remember that. Okay, so that's for objectives. So what you're going to do for this assignment is for your units, you should know right now what grade level, what subject, and what topic that you want to do your unit on. Once you know that, you need to have at least one goal for your whole unit. You can have more than one, but you need to at least have one. Okay? You also need to have printed your standards at this point that go with this unit. So what you're going to do is you're going to build your objectives based on that the standards that you pull from the course of study. Okay? You're going to have a minimum of 10 objectives. 10. Okay? 10 different objectives. You're ultimately going to have 5 lesson plans, more if you need it, but as few as 5. Day 5 can't be a test day. So you need 5 days of teaching. 5 days. So you can do 2 objectives per day, or you can do 1 on one day, 2 or 3 on the next, a few more. As long as you have 10 distinct objectives, that's the goal for this assignment. Okay? Hope you don't have any questions on writing your objectives, but if you do, you can always Facebook me. You can Facebook me. You can message me on Blackboard or you can email me. All right, so what I want you to do is create a draft, come up with one goal and draft of your 10 objectives, and try to write those objectives so that they measure students on different levels of learning. They're not just on the knowledge level. Okay, so that's part one.